Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erica Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. I am your host, Erica Mayall. Today's guest is someone who I've been wanting to have on the podcast for a very, very long time. So I'm really excited that we've finally been able to make it happen today. Dr. Stephanie Potreck is a medical doctor, sports nutritionist, researcher, and former dancer whose work challenges the idea that complex health problems have simple explanations. Her clinical research interests include low energy availability, eating disorders, stress physiology, female athlete health, and the unique demands of dance. She is particularly interested in the overlap between REDS, allostatic load, and the broader neuroendocrine adaptation seen in athletes under chronic physical and psychological stress. Stephanie is passionate about translating science into practical conversations that empower dancers, clinicians, and educators to ask better questions, not just arrive at faster answers, which is why I am so excited to chat with her today because we have a lot in common in that regard. So welcome to the podcast, Stephanie. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting me and having me on here.
Anytime I have a guest on the podcast, I like to start with just getting a little bit of background information and hearing a bit about people's kind of introduction to dance or journey into dance. So can you just tell us a little bit about when you started dance, what you remember of like your earliest memories of dance?
My earliest memories of dance? Oh, good question. I think actually I started afterwards. So that must have been kindergarten still or so maybe around the age of 5 or so. Two of my best friends were performing in a probably end of year show or so, and I got to watch this one. And then afterwards, I was like, I want to do the same. I want to be with them. I want to do ballet. And so I was actually introduced to Vaganova ballet. So normally people sort of associate me with RAD ballet, but I think it was only around grade 5 or so that I actually switched. And I then had a teacher who was very much into, you should be trying jazz, you should be trying tap dance, you should be trying singing. And so I actually ended up doing musical theatre. She was sending me to summer school. She was you should be trying this school. And that probably would be an adventure as well. And so, one of these summer intensives, I was able to audition for the school and ended up doing my degree in London at the Theatre Academy. So that's basically that in a nutshell. Unfortunately, though, I was during my 3rd year, so during my graduation year, I was actually badly injured. So I fractured a vertebra in preparation for the then advanced RAD exam. When it wasn't split into 1 and 2. So way back when. That's what we are talking about. And dance medicine wasn't back then what it is today. And so I really had to search for someone to sort of have an idea of what was going on, because the first reaction was NHS. So as it was in the UK, as it happened in the UK, the NHS reaction was like, we've got to immobilize you. You get a metal plate front and back off your spine, and then it's going to be fine. I was like, that doesn't sound right to me. So long journey, got to see a soccer doctor, a very famous soccer doctor. He was the same as no way, it's not going to happen. And I ended up in Zurich, where I would say normal family physician, married to one of the principal dancers of Zurich Ballet, was very, very interested in dance and dancers. And it was just so sweet. I never forget. It was made possible that I could go and see him in Zurich. And he was like, first thing that we do is I'm going to take you to a colleague of mine, a radiologist, and then he's going to take some x-rays and, those we only do in Switzerland, but then we definitely can assess much better what's actually going on. So, okay, that sounds a lot better. I actually ended up having no surgery at all. And having loads and loads of physio. Surprise, surprise. Mm-hmm. So yes, of course, the fracture did need to heal. first, but then I was really very much into physio for a very long time, and that's the only reason I can still dance today. So really shout out to this guy who just, I don't know, was thinking a little bit differently, I would say, and had a real interest in this topic. And yeah, I mean, it's not because of him that I studied medicine. I get this asked quite often. I think it was more some sort of stubbornness. So, okay, if I can't do dance, then I've got to do something else that's sort of, yeah, I don't know, not particularly easy to achieve. And so, okay, let's go to med school. So I applied for med school. I went to med school. So there was certainly some degree of stubbornness in this. And then I actually discovered all the subspecialties of medicine. I just got carried away, and it was, oh my God, this is so interesting, and that is so interesting. And like almost every med student, there was a time when I thought, like, oh, I want to do surgery, only to realize how misogynistic and toxic this environment actually is. And yeah, so long story short, I ended up in human genetics. I ended up in global health, and at some point, despite these two being really fascinating, I felt very much, must have been in my mid-30s then, now beginning mid-30s, yeah, that I felt this environment is very toxic. This work environment is very toxic. I absolutely loved medicine, but I think I sometimes felt too reminded of structures that we know from other high performance environment like dance or any sort of elite sports. And I took a sabbatical and moved back to Sydney and found myself back in the studios of Sydney Dance Company 5 times a week, or however often I wanted to dance. And I think it didn't even take 3 months that I thought, okay, I've got to do something, and started studying sports nutrition.
Interesting.
And then
the rest is history now.
Yeah.
So, and that's such an interesting journey, because I think a lot of people end up in dance medicine or sort of fields adjacent to dance medicine because of direct experiences that they had. And in your case, it sounds like that was not necessarily the direct pathway where you had this experience with a doctor who really helped you and were like, oh, I want to do the same thing. It was just like, okay, here's this other field. I'm going to go in something completely different. And then eventually found your way back to sort of dance and then joining the two. At the time when you kind of had that idea of like, okay, I need to do something with dancers or start to kind of look at that, did you know that the sort of area of nutrition and low energy availability and like that side of medicine was where you were going to end up? Or was it more just like, actually, I just want to help dancers in general?
It was, I absolutely started off with, I want to help dancers in general. And nutrition was just something I thought could be worth adding. Just because, you know, every time I spoke to a dancer, it was like, well, there's a nutritional issue. There's some beliefs and thoughts about food that don't seem to be particularly helpful. And I thought, maybe that would be smart. How much these two, or how much I would be able to combine these two, I had absolutely no idea. I really had absolutely no idea. And I also must say that really studying sports nutrition was one of the most humbling experiences of my life, because as a doctor at med school, you've got like 4 or 5 hours of nutrition and you think like, you know it all. You absolutely know nothing.
Yeah.
I found that, I found that so humbling, and I can still get so upset when it happens to me. It happens to me. I go to the GP and the GP goes like, yeah, but let's talk about your BMI. It's like, yeah, no, we are not going to talk about it, you know, because we can talk about my blood parameters. We can talk about the latest test results, but we can't talk about my BMI. It's wild. So it was really one of the most humbling experiences of my life. And up until this day, I think when it comes to things like relative energy deficiency or low energy availability, and probably some other conditions as well, I would say the dietitians are better at reading blood test results than the doctors are most of the time.
Yeah, and that's my experience here in Canada as well, because I know it does vary a little bit throughout the world in terms of what falls under which professional scope of practice. But I find the same thing here, that especially GPs, but even some of the sports medicine doctors and stuff, they're really, if they're looking at blood results, looking at, bare minimum levels of things. So as long as you fall within that sort of quote unquote normal range, they're like, oh, it's fine. Whereas potentially the naturopaths or the dietitians or people like that are actually looking at, okay, well, like, we want to look at like optimal levels for functioning, and especially when you're dealing with dancers or other high level athletes, like bare minimum is probably not necessarily going to cut it. So I totally agree here that I find the same thing, that a lot of the doctors, and their scope is so massive that they just, like you said, like they have a few hours of experience and exposure to those areas of like specialty. And so then they're just not equipped to really like dive into the nuances of all of that stuff.
Absolutely.
There has thankfully been an increasing awareness, I will say, within the dance world in the last number of years in terms of this relative energy deficiency in sport or dance, whatever you want to call it. And we, in fact, did an episode a few months ago with Project Red D on the podcast. So if anybody listening has not heard that episode yet, definitely go check that out, because that will give you some background information on this as well. And this was something that, like, when I was dancing, there was never any discussion or knowledge. I, in fact, never heard about this until I was doing my undergraduate degree in kinesiology. And that was the first time I was ever exposed to what back then was more often termed the female athlete triad, or, those types of things. But while I was dancing, there was certainly, at least within my spheres, no awareness of this. And I will say there's slowly becoming more awareness of this, but there's obviously still more work that needs to be done in terms of your work, because you're obviously embedded in this a lot more thoroughly. Do you also see that there is a bit of an increasing awareness of this low energy availability or REDS in the dance world?
Yeah, I mean, I find that such an interesting question, because in the preparation of this podcast, I thought, what are we actually doing today? So we are talking about whether REDS exists and why there is criticism of this model, while at the same time, so much or such a huge part of the dance world is still stuck in the 20th century and debating whether dancers are allowed to eat enough. Do you know what I mean? I just thought...
Yeah, absolutely.
This is just such, I don't know, two ends of a spectrum or so. But yes, I have to say, I do believe there is more awareness of relative energy deficiency. Maybe. I mean, I can't really pin that down to some statistics, but I would say from what I get to see in my clinical life, probably it's even more the dancers than the schools.
Yes, and I would say I see the same thing.
Okay. I think really there's more, or these future generations, or now pre-professional or young professionals, they have grown up with more advocacy and more information, which can be a good thing and a bad thing, depending on where you get your information from. But it feels to me that schools and companies, or raising awareness in schools and companies, is still quite a difficult thing, because you are met with such a wall of, this is how it's always been done, we know better. It's just sometimes, and unfortunately, these sorts of faculties are still around, where you think, do they believe they acquired universal knowledge by divine intervention? Yeah, I know, it's a little bit provocative, but it can feel like it, because this is how they treat their young dancers.
Yeah, the expert on every area of dancer development, when in reality, it's probably, they're experts at teaching ballet or whatever it is, and should probably leave the injury advice and nutrition advice and all of that to the experts. I also run into, and I don't know if this is something you see as well, that especially, and I will say this is maybe more in the like competitive studios and the community studios that I deal with, where the staff is actually very on board with and willing to like learn and open-minded, but they just don't have, whether it's like the money or the resources to be able to bring in the experts or sort of facilitate those types of things. And I think we see that too at some of the larger, like say vocational schools and stuff, where some of the change that's maybe not come around yet is perhaps because of lack of resources within the arts and not always because of lack of willingness to sort of create change. And we see that too, even with companies that still, like even, here locally in Vancouver, there are professional companies that still don't have physiotherapists on staff. And it's not because they don't think their dancers get injured. They absolutely know their dancers get injured, but they don't have the resources and the funding in the arts to be able to do that. And I imagine that's probably similar with some of these sort of nutritional challenges we see with dancers as well.
Yeah, absolutely. What I find sometimes difficult is when I'm approached by parents and I know the tuition fees they pay for, let's say, what they get and what they don't get. And then it's, you've got to fix this, but we can pay for it. And it's, just being a good person is not paying my bills.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Also, it would make me, and I find that's even way more important. It would make me complicit with the system, and I don't want to be complicit with the system.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, and that's the same with me as well. And I have conversations with other physios in the area like that work within the arts as well, and it's like, how much, of your services do you give to the system, where really at the end of the day, they should be paying the dancers and everybody within the system actual appropriate living wages and stuff. And so there is a certain amount of wanting to support the arts and wanting to support those dancers, but you're 100% right. Like, we don't want to also then become complicit within the system as well. You alluded to, and we're going to dive into it like a whole bunch more now, but sort of this idea that there is a little bit of debate that exists around whether RED, so that's relative energy deficiency in sport, or sometimes called RED-D in dance, whether that actually sort of exists, and I'll use that a bit in quotation marks, as a separate entity, or whether it is just something that overlaps or almost a symptom of things involving stress physiology or allostatic load. Can you tell us a little bit more, or kind of explain a bit more about where this discourse is coming from, or a little bit about this debate?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, early in the 1990s, the term female athlete triad was coined. And that was a huge breakthrough at this time, because it raised awareness where awareness needed to be raised. Definitely in lots of aesthetic sports, but basically sports in general. But it was focused on the female athlete. It was focused on energy intake, on low bone density. So I should say. So it was very basic, but it was very helpful at this time. And every model in medicine is sort of wrong in the technical sense. Every model is a simplification. So obviously the triad was a simplification.
Yeah.
When the term REDS was coined for the first time in 2014, because there was a group of researchers not particularly happy with how the triad was defined and how it was evolved, because it didn't really match what they were seeing clinically. And they said, it's not reproductive. It's not just the reproductive axis and the bones and energy intake. There's so much more, because that's health parameters, but we also see performance suffering when there's ongoing underfueling in athletes. And so that's why they coined the term relative energy deficiency in sport. They made the whole model a bit broader. And that is good in many ways, and that is not so great in other ways. So the one thing is, for those saying, yes, reds does exist, and it's a good thing that it does exist, it's about saving the athlete. And for those criticizing it and saying, no, it's not precise enough, it's, if everything is reds, is anything reds? They want to save the science. So these are probably the two camps we are talking about at the moment. And as there's been so much debate, and I think it can be really quite confusing to say, like, does it not exist or does it not exist? I would say the triad gave us the first lens of how to look at underfueling. And then reds gave us another one so that we could, like, a higher resolution image. Yeah. And now the question is this enough, or is it still a simplification? And does it come with a risk of overdiagnosing? And do we have to look at other parameters as well? I'm actually not quite sure what comes next than high resolution image. And I don't know, whatever is better, right? Do we have to look at it through this lens? And I think it's actually a really good thing that this debate is happening, because that's what sort of drives the whole thing forward, and is going to make diagnosis better and more accurate. And eventually we will be able to sort of filter dancers or athletes in general, filter them out and be like, that's definitely reds, but that's only a bit of reds and a lot of other things going on. So the problem with reds is that there are a lot of symptoms that are rather unspecific. So if you look back at the triad, early 90s, it was, yes, we have biomarkers for our reproductive axis. We have imaging for bone density. Energy intake, that is a thing. It's, let's say, it's well doable under lab conditions, but under real life conditions, it's definitely one of the things nutrition as a science definitely suffers from, because it's terribly inaccurate. Self-report. Okay. AI may help in the future, because there are these apps now where you can actually take photos and it's going to calculate.
Photos,
Yeah, I find that a really interesting thing, because so far, any study with real life conditions the risk of underreporting is huge. So,
especially in dancer populations, I imagine.
Absolutely. If you've, when you've grown up being judged for what you eat. Yes. Do you want to report this? Do you really feel safe, even if you're part of a study where it's said everything is anonymized and so on and so on? I know a lot of dancers not feeling safe enough to really report. Exactly. What was the next thing I wanted to say? Yes, and measuring energy expenditure. That's well doable under lab conditions in real life. Fitness trackers, estimates. Yeah. So this is one of the things where we've got to say that is definitely one of the core problems of defining reds or measuring reds. And we just have to really make clear that reds is not a diagnosis in the medical sense, but it gives us a picture. And we've got to exclude a lot of differential diagnoses in order to say it's nothing else. So we are pretty sure it's reds. Yes. And there's also been a lot of, I would say, misinterpretation, because I remember that in the late 90s and early 2000s, Anne Lux and her team defined this threshold of what is low energy availability, or what they then called low energy availability back then. And that was 30 grams per kilogram fat-free mass per day as energy intake. Everything below was set to be low energy availability. Anything above was set to be not particularly sufficient, but definitely not defined as low energy availability. But they said the studies they did, they all were done under very, very tightly controlled laboratory conditions. So what they could trace back why they saw what they saw. Whereas in real life, we absolutely know that we can have two dancers and they they reach 30, these magical 30 kilocalories per kilogram fat-free mass per day. One is going to respond with reds, the other one is not. And that is probably sort of pointing towards what's our problem with reds. We don't have very clear thresholds. We don't have very clear biomarkers. And yes, we have a list of biomarkers that we can actually like look at and be like, okay, tick the box, tick the box, tick the box. This CAT tool, so this clinical assessment tool, this does help. But it still doesn't mean that we can say, okay, it's reds only, because we still have to think of all the differential diagnoses. We have to think of, let's just randomly pick one biomarker, elevated lipid profile. Yeah. We do see that in reds because a starving energy metabolism is going to affect the lipid metabolism as well. And we don't see reduced lipids in our bloods, but we see very often elevated. But we see this in neurodivergence as well. Yeah. So, and this is where it really becomes tricky, because if we start reducing everything to reds, it's going to be really difficult to tell a neurodivergent dancer to just eat more and reach energy balance, and that everything will be solved afterwards. We just and only have to reach energy balance at the end of the day. There are other things coming into play. Then we don't fully understand yet why they still have, or why they very often show up with a altered lipid profile. Maybe we can't even really treat this fully. Maybe we don't get this back to a normal range. There are other things, gastrointestinal symptoms. Let's talk about reds and hypermobility and neurodivergence. Yes, of course, if the body is starving, it does break down muscles of our gut. So yes, I think or we can think of, if we don't have our normal muscle mass in our gut, probably the transport of our food in our gut will be impaired one way or another. And very often, underfueling comes with gastrointestinal problems of all sorts, diarrhea, constipation, bloating, and so on. But then again, we've got the hypermobile population. They may be in energy balance, but still experience gastrointestinal symptoms. For them, the right decision may be to have a diet or to eat a diet that is lower in fiber. Completely different scenario. And then we have a neurodivergent population. And for them, it may be more about like the sensory input. What actually do I enjoy eating and what do I not? So this is why reds has been criticized quite a bit, because if you look at it simplified, it's just like you can screen dancers, you can screen a whole company and be like, oh goodness, almost everyone fits in here. When they don't. There are definitely multiple reasons why someone responds to the environment they are in the way they respond to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And then I think the bigger or maybe broader question does come back to that environment. And so if it is like, we have to look at our dancers as humans first, and how we interact and how our like nervous system regulates and how our hormones respond to. And when I'm talking about hormones, I don't just mean like, reproductive hormones, but especially things like cortisol and stress hormones and stuff. And so that's sort of where, all of this becomes quite complex, because like you said, you can have two dancers who present exactly the same and they're not going to present the same to intervention if you just said you both need to, eat more or balance those like energy, that energy availability, because one of them may be dealing with all sorts of other environmental stressors or things going on in the background that is going to affect how their body and their physiology responds, and the other dancer may not. So that's, it's, like you said, quite a lot more complex than maybe reds would have us believe when we sort of break down that framework. At the end of the day, because I think, like you said, this is a debate that's going on right now. There's not a right or a wrong answer necessarily. And like, I like your analogy of it being sort of just like a bit more high resolution and higher resolution, as like, if you think back to like, you know, the first generation of iPhones and the like quality of photos that they took. And now it's like the quality that we can take now. At the end of the day, I don't want to say, do you think it matters? But in a population, so with dancers, where a lot of our dancers are still in an environment where they may be criticized for eating, and there's so much emphasis on aesthetics and all of these other challenges that we are still dealing with. Do you think it matters? That's not the right word, but how important do you think it is that we can actually label it REDS versus maybe not REDS, but something else, like we were saying, with maybe more of this like physiological response or the allostatic load? Do you think this debate is important, or do you think we still have so much work to do just in terms of creating a culture where dancers can just be in their bodies, that debating these finer points is maybe not the most productive use of time right now?
I actually find it really important because I recently got a little bit into soccer, so European soccer, and I filed a complaint about a Premier League club for a good reason, because of nutritional misinformation through advertising. And I didn't know, but it totally makes sense then in hindsight. And I'm using this in order to sort of illustrate what I think about dance. There's a problem in soccer. Pre-professionals and professionals, males and females, don't really meet their energy needs at the end of the day. Surprise, surprise. But what we say, it's just as bad as in dance. Most of them function a lot better than dancers do. Most of them have fewer psychological problems than dancers have. So somehow we're talking about the same and yet two very, very different populations. Yeah. And this also shows us how much of a spectrum REDS can be. Yeah, because I would say in dance, I find it extremely important that we talk about it and that we think about it, and maybe that we even think a little further. Because it includes so much more than in other sports. It includes so many more symptoms, so much more scrutiny, so much more growing up in relentless environments. Many environments still are relentless. And if they are not relentless, they are at least highly competitive. And the psychological aspect of dance, I think, is just a lot worse than in other sports. I'm not saying, so please don't get me wrong, I'm not saying there isn't high pressure and other sports environments can be relentless. They absolutely can. But I think, unfortunately, on the negative side of things, dance is a little bit outstanding there. Yeah, so I do believe that it's incredibly important that we talk about it, because if not dancers, I mean, think about this, or think about how many dancers say they feel almost traumatized because of their pre-professional education. They feel they never got the tools to sort of cope with adult life. They never really grew up. They sort of have to catch up later. They just feel not ready to face the world, quite some of them. What does it do to the body? And we've had a really interesting discussion in one webinar about allostatic load, because we always talk about high cortisol. Stress drives high cortisol. Actually, when we are exposed to relentless environments early on, it may blunt the cortisol response. So we absolutely need to look at this. And I always look at this in dancers, because, I mean, it's a blunted cortisol response is not a good thing either. So don't get me wrong, it's not great either. But it feels for me that so often in dance we've got to look beyond, because high cortisol is the one thing, a stressed body because of physiological stress, of psychological stress, because of a combination of both, is the one thing. But understanding that actually with experiences like those many of us have made in the dance environment, it may be the other way around, and we have a blunted cortisol response. And I think that's why it's so important to talk about, does REDS exist? Like, are we looking through the right lens, or do we need like better contact lenses, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And to have like that clarity. And I think that this ties in also with something that I've talked about lots on the podcast before, and just sort of the, like just nervous system regulation in general is a topic that we talk about quite a lot, just in the context of like teaching and being able to learn. And especially I talk about it most in the context of like flexibility and mobility training. And it's that same idea of, if somebody is always exposed to that sympathetic state, like if you're always in that fight or flight state, then your body becomes accustomed to living in that state, and you start to have like altered reactions to things. And it's not that they're, you know, better able to tolerate stress necessarily. It's just that the body, like you're saying, with those like blunted cortisol response, it does eventually sort of quote unquote learn how to like adapt to that. But that is not necessarily a strategy that is going to serve you in the long run. There's going to be consequences to that later on down the road. And so being able to figure those things out and actually look at dancers in the context of the broader environment that they're in, and really probably bringing it back to the culture of dance in terms of, and that is one of the things I wanted to ask you about, was the current sort of challenges with the culture of dance. I know we sort of there seems to be a bit of like a pendulum where sometimes it starts to swing one way and you think like, oh, like there actually seems to be progress being made in terms of the culture that is existing within the dance world, and especially in some of these like really high performance dance environments. And then it starts to feel like it swings the other direction. And I think this is probably a reflection of what happens with society in general. Like right now, I know there's a bit of a resurgence of kind of this, I don't know if we want to call it skinny talk, or this like cultural broader, not even just within the dance world. And then that obviously becomes reflected in the dance world. But how much do you see these, we'll call them trends, in terms of cultural perceptions of body image and that type of thing? How much do you see that permeate into the dancers that you work with?
Do you want to know how many I see at the moment? So I would say starting probably, I think it became a trend, or a trend that popped up in clinic last year. You mean on Ozempic or any GLP-1s? And how much I would like to sort of call out all my colleagues prescribing these? Many, way too many. So these injections are now being used in order to fit an idea that was unsustainable in the first place. And when I talk about this with the dancers, I mean it's just such a quick go-to solution, right? And then we've got to talk about, yes, you're going to lose some body fat, that's right, but also you're going to lose muscle. Is that something you want as a dancer? Is that something that's going to help you? And then you are probably going to be more underfueled than before. Shall we talk about what underfueling does to the brain, so that eventually you will end up not being able to see situations for what they really are? Do we want to talk about this? I mean, these are really hard discussions that I need to have. But unfortunately, I see it way too often.
Yeah,
Yes.
and I think, I was just going to say, I think the dance world it's almost like putting a magnifying glass on some of those issues that we're seeing within just society at large. And then it's like when you're in this like really intense environment that you're so scrutinized, and especially for like an aesthetic, it almost like magnifies that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say it's another factor, and probably that maybe is then when we should more look at and you just said this already, from a systems point of view, because this is a lot about the system. This is no longer about energy availability or health and performance consequences as a result of low energy availability. This is about a system they find themselves in and that they respond to, because obviously, if you are injecting GLP-1s, you are responding to the system around you. And that is obviously more on the psychological side of things. But is that actually good for you? Short term, medium term, long term? Is that good for your overall health, physically, mentally? It's really more this systems thinking, I'm afraid.
Yeah. And I think so many topics we talk about on the podcast really do come back to that a lot of the time, in terms of like, how do we create, these systems and a culture that actually supports all aspects of dancer health and wellness? Because unless we have like a system, like you said, in place, all of these individual, whether it's like low energy availability, whether it's overtraining, whether it's, extreme flexibility, like whatever it is, it doesn't matter what the issue is in the dance world, unless the system is in a place where it's actually putting not even dancers first, but the human first before them as a dancer, so that we're looking at what are the things that promote health and wellness within this human being so that they can be the best dancer that they can be. And that's where I think the dance world still maybe doesn't get that right, because I think we often just look at them still as dancers first and not necessarily humans first. And so it's so easy to sort of think about, okay, what are all the ways that we can sort of like, quote unquote, optimize them as a dancer without realizing what are the consequences for them being a human being, either when their dance career ends or just for the rest of their life. So, yeah.
Absolutely. I could not agree more. And I also think, we expect them as audiences. So from the audience point of view, we expect them to show us on stage something about real life, real emotions, but they are kept with not enough energy, so underfueled, not even being able, and we know that from studies, they're not able to tap into their full range or their full repertoire of emotions. And that doesn't sit well with me at all, because what are we asking of them? And under what conditions are they allowed to sort of show us what we want to see? Because it's just so contradictory. It's not possible. It's not even possible. And I also wonder, and I mean, I know this is for many people very provocative as well, but when we have a humanitarian crisis, or this is where my global health comes in quite obviously, but if we have a humanitarian crisis on this planet somewhere, people go donate to facilitate humanitarian aid, and then they go and see the same physiology on stage and pay, like, I don't know, 120 euros for the ticket. Are we good? You know what I mean, right? And I mean, this is, and I'm allowed I'm allowed to draw this analogy, because this is actually one of the Bradford Hill criteria. In order for something to be quite reliable or valid, we need analogies. And yes, starvation, underfueling, malnutrition, they are all very similar. The stressors, the life stressors, are definitely different, whether you grow up or you dance or you work in a relentless environment, or whether you are in a war zone. Absolutely, yeah. But the basic effects of undernutrition on the body, sorry to disappoint, but they are the same.
Yeah, absolutely. Just, in one instance, it is almost, I don't want to say celebrated, but it's like, it's the desired aesthetic, or it's the ideal. And in another case, like you said, it's a humanitarian crisis. So definitely food for thought in terms of how we're thinking about the environments that dancers are operating in. In terms of where do we go from here? So, we can continue to have this debate, and people within the field, I'm sure, will continue to have this debate about whether REDS exists, or whether we need to look at it from a slightly different lens or a broader lens. But for dancers, or even if there's teachers or parents or whoever listening, where do we go in terms of pushing forwards? Because people within those dance environments are not going to really have any influence about the debate of whether, which lens we look at this through. But if we have dancers who are, potentially being underfueled and are struggling with symptoms, or, dance educators who are looking at creating better environments, what would you say would be like the most appropriate steps forwards in terms of like recognition and prevention and changing some of what we're seeing within the dance world?
Yeah. From a family perspective, I would say the very best results, but this doesn't mean they got away unscathed. So the dance world is notoriously difficult to navigate. But the families where the parents reached out when the kids were around 13, 14, 15, so transitioning into full-time training and building their own healthcare team if there wasn't access anyway, I would say they probably did best. And it's certainly, as I said, even if not everything goes according to plan, and even if there are blips, it's probably less of an investment than if you wait for too long. I think really this preventative approach of we do this early, they know with the kids, they know they can reach out if anything feels like off. And then maybe it's a session or 2 or 3. You probably know this from physiotherapy as well. The ones coming in early with a nigger don't get the injury. Yeah. They have the nigger nevertheless, but they don't get the injury. Whereas if you wait until the injury is sort of not healing because you're sitting at home and being told to not eat in order to come back in shape, that's going to be more of a financial strain. So I would say from clinical experience, that's the approach that absolutely works best. What I also very much like is high schools where dance is sort of part of the afternoon program. Just inviting someone, sometimes it's me, sometimes it's someone else, for giving them an idea of where are we at in terms of nutrition for very active kids. Because we also have to acknowledge that these days, the parent generation is the generation that grew up with normative discontent. So these days, it's absolutely normalized to not be or not feel okay about your body. It's like you're the odd one out if you are fine with your body and happy. This is the parent generation, and sometimes it does help quite a lot to address this and say, I'm not saying you all have problems, but that's the world we are living in. And that is what influences us, and that is what has shaped us. So do we want to pass this on to our kids? And then also juxtapose what's going on in the general population where kids are not as active, and what's going on nutrition-wise, because that's what you see in the headlines the most. Does that apply to your kid? No, it doesn't. Yeah, and why does it not? And yeah, these are really the things I enjoy the most, I would say, because it feels for me you really reach people. Whereas in school settings, if there's like one nutrition session per year, it feels like, okay, this is the one where we have to be, and we have to sit this out for 45 minutes and then it's over. So the message doesn't really reach the recipient.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe we haven't emphasized this enough. Families do play a big role in all of this as well.
Yeah. And I think that that's unique to the dance world as well, is that a lot of young dancers are potentially going away to vocational schools at young ages. And so then the family cannot play as much of a role. And so you don't have the family sitting down to family dinner every night together. Like the kid or the dancer is just in a different environment. And I think that absolutely influences just their relationship with food and with all of that, because like you said, the family does play a big role. I just want to emphasize as well what you said in terms of the kind of like early intervention, because we do absolutely see the same thing in physio. Like the dancers who start coming regularly when for me, it's almost even a tiny bit younger. I would say it's like 11, 12, like when they're often kind of entering adolescent growth spurt. And so they have all these little niggles, but generally if they're sort of coming semi-regularly, or they kind of develop a relationship with a healthcare team, they are the ones who tend to do better long-term, because I think they learn so much about their body in the process. So then even when they transition to university dance programs or professional dance careers, they have skills and tools and know where to find information. So I have people, dancers that I've known since they were little, and they're maybe off away at a university program, but they'll reach out every once in a while with a question. Oh, this is what I'm dealing with. I saw this thing on TikTok, but it seems like probably not the thing I want to be doing. What should I be doing instead? And I think in terms of like nutrition and fueling, that's probably the same. If you have a dancer who's had exposure to high quality and legitimate information and evidence-informed information from a young age, when they are in a situation or an environment where maybe, like you said, things feel a bit off, they, A, are probably going to be able to recognize that more, but B, also know where to go to find resources to address it. And so I think that is a huge part of early intervention that we maybe don't talk about enough. Is, yes, the actual intervention itself is probably like helpful, but it is also just their exposure to it allows them to then later know where to go and find like high quality information that is not just, oh, somebody told me this, or I saw this when I Googled it, or, I found this on social media, because that's a huge thing that we see a lot, is dancers accessing information that they think is good information, but oftentimes is not at all vetted information or really at all evidence-informed information that's just being circulated on social media platforms.
Exactly. And I would say it's the same for parents, which is why it's important to sort of get them on board, because they are now the generation, the parents of now pre-professional students, they are the generation also shaped and influenced by what they see on social media. And how do you pick fact from fiction? It's good to have like a reliable source where, like, okay, it's not like the topless influencer, but they may have a university degree.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of that flies around. Although I will say the younger generation, like you said, the parents are definitely still of the generation where they're like on social media, but I'm finding some of the younger generation, like the dancers coming up now, the early teens, they're actually almost like rebelling against some, like, they're choosing not to have smartphones and they're choosing not to have social media accounts. So it actually is really interesting to see, again, these pendulum swings within the dance world. And I don't know if it'll stay like that forever, but it's interesting to have conversations with these young dancers who have seen maybe the effects of that and are choosing a different path forward, which is cool.
Absolutely, because I mean, think of when you dance or when I dance, we were not exposed to 24/7 curated, perfectionized feeds.
No, there were no feeds.
Exactly, there were no feeds.
We didn't even have access to videos of professional dancers for the most part. Like, it was rare to be able, unless you could like go to a performance in person, it was rare to even see video footage of dancers from other areas of the world. Like, every once in a while you would have access to that, but it was not, you couldn't just go to YouTube and look at any dancer under the sun. So yeah, no, it was a very, very different climate for sure. All right. I am going to start to wrap things up here because I've taken a lot of your time and I really appreciate all of your thought and nuance that's gone into this. Is there anything that you feel like we haven't covered that you want to touch on, just to sort of drive home any points, especially for the listeners out there?
So if anyone is still confused about whether RED-S is sort of a good or bad clinical label, as we said, it's not a diagnosis. I think the question is not really whether or if RED-S is right or wrong. It's whether it's useful, where it's useful, and where it stops explaining what we are seeing. That's probably mostly for clinicians, but definitely I think we absolutely need to stay curious, because the risk would be to stop being curious once we have a diagnosis, quote unquote diagnosis. Yeah, I think it's a really helpful model, and I don't think the next task or the next step would be to be like, oh, let's just replace RED-S. It's like, no, let's in some aspects narrow down what RADS really is and what it causes. And in other aspects, let's broaden it, because psychological stress may just as much contribute to RADS, but is under-acknowledged at the time being. I really don't think we don't invent ourselves anew, even if social media wants to make us believe this. We don't constantly invent ourselves anew, so we don't constantly have to invent a new medical model, because it will be flawed one way or another anyway, because humans are complex, and just squeezing them into a simplistic model is just never going to work out 100%. But using what we have and all the work that's been put into it, because that didn't just happen without doing a lot of work. And at the same time, maybe like clinical humility, and accepting that probably we'll never know enough. We'll never reach the point to really know enough, in the sense of knowing 100% what's going on. We're not going to reach these 100%, but the closer we come, the better the result for the dancer.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that holds true for a lot of areas of medicine, where it's like we're never going to know 100%. And as we learn more and as technology improves, we just have to continue to, like you said, stay curious and evolve and continue to expand our thinking, because technology and research is always advancing. So things are different now than they were 5 years ago or 10 years ago or 25 years ago. That has all been such fantastic information and a really great conversation in terms of food for thought for people within, especially like the dance world, and people who maybe are only just starting to become more aware of the idea of low energy availability, and have given them a little bit more to think about in terms of the nuance of how this fits into the broader picture of the person who is dancing. So like human first, who is dancing. So I really appreciate your time and expertise on this matter. If listeners want to connect with you or learn more, what are the best ways to reach out?
It's definitely Instagram at the moment, AusDancersOverseas, and it's definitely Substack at the moment. Life of a Dance Nutrition Doctor.
Perfect. And I will link those in the show notes for anyone who's listening. So I'll have a link to both of those if you want to get in touch with Stephanie or just follow her to learn more. She puts out such great content, especially on Instagram. Like, so much research and thought goes into her content. So if you are looking for reliable sources of information to follow, her account is definitely one that everyone should be following. So I'll put that in the show notes. So go follow her if you are not already. Once again, thank you so much for taking time to share your expertise with the audience today, Stephanie. I really, really appreciate it. And I hope everybody who's listening has a great rest of your day.